presenter is Professor Pamela Abshire. Professor Abshire is a professor in the Electrical and Computer Engineering Department, as well as the Institute of Systems Research. And she's going to be talking about her really cool work on sniffing out odors on a nano quadcopter. So very excited to hear about that. So please take it away.
So thank you so much for the opportunity to talk today. So first of all, I want to thank my collaborators in this work, Alexander Castro, who's a PhD student who's wrapping up his work right now, and Professor Timothy Horiuchi, who will figure very prominently in some of the pieces of this talk. So this has been a fun collaboration and has been also part of an Air Force Center of Excellence, the Nature-Inspired Flight Technologies and Ideas, that is that has its logo highlighted there. So I want to start us off with a video that is just a kind of an inspirational video for an application that is kind of a guiding idea for us, is that if you have a small quadcopter that's able to easily navigate inside indoor spaces around human operators, and you'd want to find the source of an odor. The idea is that you could go in, settle down, sniff for a while, take off again, check out another room, see if you can localize the source of an odor that you're trying to find. And so this video is intended just to motivate where we think we're going with this line of work. So we'd like to be able to use this kind of platform to localize odors in unstructured indoor environments, without some of the traditional features that people have used in a lot of odor localization work so far. So the platform that we're working with, I'll just start out by introducing that. We're using, one of these very flexible platforms, the Crazyfly with its flow deck expansion board. What you can see here, I'm not sure if I can have, annotate. I don't see my annotation available. Anyway, maybe you can see my cursor. So there's the Crazyfly platform. On top, you have a 3D printed arm for placing the sensor. And then we have a gas sensor board that essentially uses just some power regulation, analog to digital conversion, a commercially available gas sensor. There aren't a lot of options here, so what we're using, it happens to be sensitive to alcohol. We would be happy to swap out that gas sensor for another better gas sensor or for other kinds of sensors. And on campus, I've been working with Professor Elizabeth Smela, who was also mentioned in the last talk, and Professor Ricardo Araneda on some different kinds of not just bio-inspired, but biological technologies for odor detection and other work. And also some H-bridge drivers for helping us to drive the rotors in ways that you'll see later in the talk. So that's the basic platform. It's essentially some slight modifications to a commercially available open source platform. The challenges that we're trying to overcome in this work are that we're not detecting the airflow in the presence of a stable, strong, prevailing wind and stable plume. We want to try to attack the hard problem of finding odors in more unstructured environments. So that's the context in which we're approaching this work. We're using commercially available small gas sensors, and they're not great. They have really slow temporal response, and they have a relatively long refractory period. The battery life of this platform is not great. It's somewhere, the minimum battery life is around 7 minutes. You'll see some data on that later in the talk. And we have some restrictions in terms of where we can place sensors and how much payload we can carry. Our max payload for the system is around 15 grams. And we also want to eventually address 3D localization, which is the advantage of being able to do this with a flying platform. So I'm going to organize this talk in terms of a number of insights we've had over time in addressing this problem. So the first insight is that gases are buoyant, which may seem obvious, but it affects where you should be looking for that odor source. There are a number of gases, hydrogen, methane, that are less dense than air, so they tend to float. But a lot of the gases that you would be interested in detecting, for example, in the context of a leak or trying to find them in an indoor environment as a potential hazard, are actually denser than air, so they sink. And the one that we're going to be focusing on for the entirety of this talk is isopropyl alcohol, or rubbing alcohol. You notice that it is a lot denser than air, so it sinks. And here's a video to show you that. This is a kind of a diffraction Schlieren image of that shows you rubbing alcohol kind of sinking. There's essentially a Q-tip impregnated with rubbing alcohol shown above, and it's just showing you essentially that the rubbing alcohol is sinking down away from this Q-tip. So that's just a demonstration that, in fact, rubbing alcohol sinks. And this was why this was something that mattered for this project. We initially started trying to find bottles of alcohol or vessels of alcohol on the ground, but that didn't work so well. And we eventually figured out that it was really hard to find alcohol on the ground because that's where it sinks to. And it's much easier if you put the source above. So most of the work that I'll show you is using the context of having a source above, and then investigating the space below a source. Because for the particular case of rubbing alcohol, that's a more interesting case. The second insight that I'll tell you about is that, believe it or not, rotors induce airflow. And rotors inducing airflow actually changes the problem of how you want to detect the odor that you're trying to detect. I had some issues with a video, so I've pasted in clips from the smoke pen tests that we carried out to be able to characterize how odors from different locations. So this is actually the Crazy Fly platform down here. This is the Crazy Fly platform. I'll point out, as you'll see shortly, that here are the rotors of the Crazy Fly platform. Here in the center, where you don't see any air passing at all, is where we initially placed the sensor. So this place is kind of a dead zone. And that was the problem that we realized when we carried out these smoke pen tests, is that if you put the sensor, and so this yellow box would indicate where we originally placed the sensor, where you would normally place it on the chassis of the drone, of the quadrotor, you don't get odors passing very efficiently over that location. So if you think, so here is our initial sensor placement. The red cross and black circle indicates our initial sensor placement. The four colored circles here indicate our rotors for the quadrotor. And if we look as we saw with the smoke pen tests, the volume of the region that is drawn into those different odors is kind of moving out away from the rotor. And so we have a catchment zone above the rotor that is pulled down primarily into each rotor. And this shows the catchment zones at 1 centimeter above the quadcopter, which is about what you would expect. It's moving outward. And then at about 11 centimeters above the quadcopter, it's even larger. And so essentially what we're looking at here is the catchment areas and how we would, the efficiency of how we would actually draw odors down into where we'd like to place a sensor. And the conclusion from this work really is that the place where we originally placed the sensor, which would be just the starting point, first pass on placing it, is absolutely the worst place to do it. And so our initial sensor placement on the body of the quadcopter was really the worst place to try to find those odors. And instead we augmented the quadcopter with a custom printed arm that placed the sensor directly above the odor. And that's a much more effective sensor placement. So you have to take into account the rotor-induced airflow and how you're actually detecting the odors in order to get the sensor where you need it to be in order to do the detection task. So that's the second insight that we had. The The third insight we'll get to in a second, we're going to start talking about the performance of being able to detect odors. And in order to define how we're quantifying detection, we first took our sensor data and used our sensor data to construct a moving average, an exponentially weighted moving average as shown here. We then used that to set a threshold that was 3 sigmas above that moving average, where the sigma was computed without a source present. And then we simply used the threshold crossing and duration. So there had to be a threshold crossing of a certain duration in order to trigger a detection. And so then we had detection intervals. And then once we had a detection interval, we could either get counts because we had a detection event, or we could have the integral of the sensory data. And so we have 2 different performance measures for detection here, the sensor integral or the detection count. So our third insight, and now I'm showing you performance data from some of this, from some of these studies, is that the quadrotor equivalent. So we're not working with a biological flying platform. We're working with a quadrotor. The quadrotor equivalent of the biological action of sniffing is its own rotor-induced flow. And so we're trying to use that rotor-induced flow now in order to think of it as how a dog or a person would move through a room looking for an odor. So when we have the rotors off, so the data on the left, so essentially the center of each of these figures is directly underneath the source, and then we have 4 different horizontal planes stacked underneath the source with different spacings. So we have essentially spacings on a 20-centimeter grid, and we have 0.8 of a meter below the source, 0.6 of a meter, 0.4 of a meter, 20 centimeters under the source. And so at these different locations, what you can see with the rotors off is that obviously the quadrotor is not flying with the rotors off. It's been placed in those locations. Is that when you're really close to the source, you get pretty solid, robust detection. But at other locations, and you get pretty solid, robust detection down low, close to the ground, because remember the alcohol source is sinking. But then for locations in between, you have very unreliable detection. And note that these measurements are literally directly underneath the source, displaced by 20 centimeters here or there. Even at 40 centimeters under the source, you get a very, very mild, almost no detection. Whereas when we start to turn the rotors on and we're actually pulling the odor and performing the quadrotor equivalent of sniffing, what you see is that in every single measured grid location, we had detection. And so this was the quadrotor equivalent of pulling the air to the sensor so that you could actually get a robust detection. So the quadrotor equivalent of sniffing is simply having its rotors on. So this is data that shows that. So the next performance comparison that I want to show you is that the sniffing. So this is kind of a duty cycled sniffing. This is assuming not that you're flying all the time 100%, but that you can sit down, and then once you're sitting down, do you want to use your rotors to draw air to you as the equivalent of sniffing or not? And so what this data and the next page will demonstrate is that by sitting on the ground, not flying, but running your rotors and pulling air through to performing the quadrotor sniffing by running your rotors at various duty cycles. So this is how much time is spent, what is the period and what is the duty cycle. You actually improve your performance more than you increase your power. And so this is simply showing you the power measurements, right? This is how the battery voltage is draining for various duty cycles and thrust levels. And the maximum is the black trace here. And then the next, these 2 traces that fall on top of each other would be, one is approximately 1/3 of the thrust versus 1/3 of the duty cycle. And so if essentially what it's showing is that you get roughly linear, roughly linear power with either thrust or duty cycle, right? If we cut the thrust by a third or we cut the duty cycle by a third, we get basically the same power profile, and we get about 3 times the power life. And this axis is in minutes. So we can extend our lifetime and improve our detection by simply landing the quadrotor and running the rotors with a reduced duty cycle below takeoff, so that we can draw air to the sensor and actually perform sniffing. And so we've quantified this in a kind of receiver operating characteristic format here, where you show the sensor integral or the detection count. So on one axis is the sensor integral on the left axis. On the right axis is the detection count. I think the count is the purple trace, and the red trace is the integral trace. But what you see in both cases are a bunch of the experimental data points that we measured, and then we've extracted the Pareto front for both of them that shows you the optimal operating conditions in terms of thrust and duty cycle for either measurements of count or measurements of the detection interval. And so what I'll summarize here are some of those points. So these are some of those points drawn from along the Pareto front, the optimal performance that we find. And if we want to characterize the performance increase in terms of how much additional sensing we get relative to the power increase, the power that we've used to get the sniffing to do that sensing, we find that we actually get a significant improvement, right, by a factor of 2 to 3 here I'm showing for the different cases of either, I think on the left, the integral, or on the right, the detection count. So that's essentially showing that even though we have to spend extra power to perform the sniffing, it actually still improves our performance. I check my time. Okay, I'm going to speed up. The fourth insight that I want to share with you is that when we turn on the rotors, and I hope you can hear the video, so we turn on the rotors, and what you see is that turning on the rotors, and this is turning on the rotors in reverse, draws the air along a surface and then up past the rotors. And so we can actually use the fact that we can actually not run rotors in forward direction, but also in reverse direction, in order to enhance detection when we're along a surface when we're sitting on the ground. And in fact, if we run the rotors either, so the blue traces here are so the left is from a front displacement from the quadrotor, the right is a side displacement from the quadrotor, and we see that in most cases, running the rotors in reverse increases detection by about a factor of 2. Okay, and so then the final insight that I want to share with you is that flying requires power. And so we characterized the power required for several different flying maneuvers. Either we take off and we hover, we stay in one place, we take off and then we move back and forth, or we take off and land repeatedly. And what we figured out was that taking off and landing repeatedly actually saves a lot of power. And what we were unsure of before we actually did the measurements is that taking off, so you might assume to start with that taking off actually requires a lot more power than flying. But the observation is that taking off doesn't require significantly more energy than flying itself. Flying requires a lot of power. So landing saves a lot of power. And so our suggestion for the best approach to carry out odor sensing on a quadrotor like this with a relatively slow sensor with sniffing to enhance your ability to perform sensing is to perform odor localization using a hop and sniff approach. And so the 5 take-home messages here are: gases are buoyant, some sink, so look for your odor sources in the right place. Rotors induce airflow, so make sure you put your sensors in your flow. The rotor-induced equivalent, the quadrotor equivalent of sniffing is rotor-induced airflow. And if you use it appropriately, you can get a significant increase in performance relative to power consumption. You can also run rotors in reverse, and that increases detection distance when you're sitting on a surface. And flying requires power. So in terms of detecting odors, in this kind of context, it's usually better to be stationary for short periods of time in order to allow that necessary detection time. And with that, there probably isn't time for any questions. There's a few references there. Thanks for your attention, and I'll thank my collaborators again, and the funding sources, AFOSR, AFRL, and the Nature Inspired Flight Center of Excellence.
Thanks a lot, Pamela. This was a very, very cool talk. I have lots of things to follow up on. There's a few questions here. I think we can just do one quick one, and then maybe offline you can, after the talk, you can look at the questions in the Q&A box. There's a question asking about if you could use a swarm concept, so gather data using a collaborative effort of a swarm of these quadrotors. And if I can add to that, have you sort of thought along the lines of active planning with this huff and sniff strategy of trying to get to the source?
We're moving in the direction of active planning, and honestly, we're just not quite there yet. So let's definitely talk about it. That's the next direction for this work. I think a swarm is definitely possible and would enhance detection. The fundamental problem is that plumes are very unstable, and so gradient-based methods are very difficult to use. We've considered having a couple of sensors on the platform, but these are pretty small platforms, and so I think what we've landed up with is more of a temporal gradient approach rather than a spatial gradient approach anyway.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. As I said, there's a few questions in the Q&A box.
I'll follow up